Cannae, August 2, 216 BCE. In the baking heat of an Apulian plain, 80,000 Roman legionaries crashed against a smaller Carthaginian army led by Hannibal Barca. By nightfall, more than half of them were dead. The river ran foul with blood, and the dust was so thick that survivors could not lift their arms. This was not supposed to happen. How did an invading force, outnumbered, short of supplies, and cut off from home, destroy Rome's greatest army on its own soil? Why did the Romans charge into a trap that seems obvious to us now? And why would any commander deliberately bend his center and invite his enemy to penetrate his line? The answers lie far beyond mere courage or luck. They reside in a mind that used the enemy's strength against itself, in a landscape turned into a weapon, and in a gamble with no margin for error. Hannibal did not invent the double envelopment to be clever. He did it because every conventional option would end in slow starvation and defeat. The Romans wanted decisive battle, he gave them one, but on his terms. He understood their impatience, he studied their formations, and he transformed his own weakness into bait. Yet to do so he had to wager his entire army on a fragile assumption that the Romans would behave exactly as he expected. If they didn't, his center would break, his wings would be isolated, and Carthage's last hope would die in a day. This is the strategic puzzle of Cannae. On one side stood an empire that drew on an alliance system spanning the Italian peninsula, with reserves of manpower unmatched in antiquity. On the other was a commander cut off from his homeland, living off the land, leading a coalition of Africans, Spaniards, Gauls, and Numidians whose loyalty was purchased with plunder. Hannibal's problem was stark: he could not outlast Rome in a war of attrition, and he could not starve a walled city without siege engines or a supply base. To force Rome to negotiate, he needed a victory so shocking that it would shatter the fabric of Roman alliances. That meant inviting the very battle he supposedly could not win. Why was bending the center and tempting a deep Roman advance the solution? What allowed Hannibal to trust that his mixed troops would hold long enough for his heavy African infantry to pivot and his Numidian horse to ride behind the Roman rear? What did he know about the Roman mind that Rome itself had forgotten? The journey to those answers begins with a map of the world in which these armies moved, a world where rivers, roads, winds, and politics were weapons as real as swords. Before the dust ever rose over Cannae, the two sides were already locked in a struggle that was as much about politics and supply as it was about swords. Hannibal had marched from Iberia with an army drawn from across the western Mediterranean, stalwart African heavy infantry outfitted in captured Roman armor, nimble Iberian swordsmen, fierce Gauls wielding long slashing blades, Balearic slingers with deadly range, and the jewel of his force, Numidian cavalrymen who seemed to become one with their horses. These 30-something thousand infantry and 10,000 horse were not a homogeneous legion. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and had different notions of honor. They were bound together only by Hannibal's charisma, the spoils of victory, and the promise of revenge. Their objective was not just to defeat Rome in the field but to fracture Rome's alliance network in Italy. Hannibal knew that as long as Rome could draw tens of thousands of allied soldiers every year, no number of battlefield victories would win the war. Facing them was the mightiest army Rome had ever assembled: 8 Roman legions swollen to overstrength, 8 allied legions, close to 80,000 heavy infantry in total with 6,000 to 8,000 cavalry. This mass was commanded by 2 consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who rotated command each day. Half of their men were fresh recruits, eager and untested, stiffened by survivors of Trebia and Lake Trasimene. Their formation, the triplex aces, was designed to break an enemy by depth. 3 lines of heavy infantry would grind forward, pushing through any resistance. Rome's objective was to destroy Hannibal's army in a single climactic battle, reassert dominance over rebellious allies, and prove that Roman virtue could not be shaken by disaster. Politically, both Varro and Paulus needed a victory to satisfy senators who were tired of Fabian caution. They also believed that Hannibal, cut off from Carthage and living off Italian farms, would wither under a drawn-out war. To them, a decisive battle was both an opportunity and a necessity. The plain near Cannae seemed to favor Rome. Situated between the river Aufidus and rolling hills, it provided ample room for Rome's deep infantry formations. The Romans had seized a supply depot there. It was a rich target for Hannibal, but its proximity to allied territories made it an ideal staging point for Roman logistics. The consuls could feed their army from the depot and from the fields of loyal towns. Hannibal, by contrast, had no base, northwest safe road back to Spain or Africa, and only what he could forage. His horses needed fodder, his men needed grain, and his baggage train was more a liability than an asset. The longer he remained in Apulia, the worse his position would become. Yet the open plain near Cannae also offered room for cavalry to maneuver. Hannibal saw that the Romans assumed the plain would neutralize his ability to ambush them. They had learned from Trebia and Trasimene to fear woods and fog. They believed that in the open they would be safe from surprises. That assumption would prove fatal. There were other constraints. The summer heat baked the flat land, raising dust that clung to armor and choked throats. The Aufidus could be a lifeline or a prison. It could quench thirst but also hem an army against its banks. Hannibal chose to camp on the south bank, facing north. This meant that, if the Romans accepted battle, they would have the sun and wind in their faces. He also controlled the access to water. His men drank when he permitted them. Morale was a constraint too. Hannibal's polyglot army had fought together for 2 years and trusted him, but their loyalty depended on continued success. A bad defeat could send Gauls and Iberians running back to their homelands. Meanwhile, the Roman consuls had to manage a divided command. Paulus favored caution while Varro wanted to attack. Each day's decision could change with the sun. The Romans had blind spots. They believed numbers alone would crush Hannibal. They dismissed the Gauls and Iberians at the Carthaginian center as barbaric rabble that would break when pushed. They had not encountered a foe who would deliberately weaken his own center to set a trap. They assumed their cavalry, though fewer, could at least hold their ground on a flat plain. They underestimated the skill of the Numidians and the cohesion of Hannibal's horsemen. They thought the open ground removed the danger of ambush. They did not conceive that the real ambush could be in their minds. They had taken to heart the lessons of Fabius, who had shadowed Hannibal and cut his foraging parties, but they rejected his refusal to seek battle. They could not imagine that Hannibal might bait them by threatening their supply post, drawing them into the terrain he had chosen. Above all, they misread the stakes. They fought to avenge past defeats and defend honor, while Hannibal fought to break the system that made Rome unbeatable. They were blind to the idea that their deepest strength, the disciplined mass of their legions, could become a liability if compressed and immobilized. Hannibal's blind spot was different. He believed that one stunning victory could bring Rome to the negotiating table. He assumed that allies would defect when Rome's armies were annihilated. He gambled that the political cost of losing tens of thousands of men would shatter Roman resolve. He did not fully appreciate Rome's ability to absorb loss and raise new legions, nor the resilience of its alliance system. This tension between his perception and Roman reality shaped his choice. He would fight a battle that looked like suicide to any conventional commander because he saw no other path. He counted on the Romans to behave exactly as their doctrine and pride dictated. If they didn't, he had no plan B. The stage was thus set on an unremarkable plain turned into a killing field. Two armies faced one another, driven by different objectives and constrained by terrain, supplies, and politics. One side had numbers and tradition, the other had cunning and desperation. Each side saw only what its own training allowed it to see. And within those constraints that seemed to choke off every option, an inverted idea began to take shape. The textbooks of the age were clear about how to fight a pitched battle. When you held the advantage in numbers and armor, you massed your heavy infantry in depth, locked shields and drove straight through the enemy's line. You refused your flanks, kept your cavalry close to guard them and trusted discipline and weight to overcome courage and cunning. This doctrine had built Rome's republic. At Sentinum, at Beneventum, at dozens of nameless fields, Roman legions had crushed spear phalanxes and tribal warbands by sheer cohesion. The triplex aces was not just a formation, it was a philosophy. It embodied the belief that moral strength and civic order would always prevail over mercenary soldiers who fought for pay. On the other side, conventional wisdom dictated that inferior armies avoid decisive battles. A smaller force with more cavalry should fight on broken ground, harass supply lines, raid farms, and force the larger army to feed itself. It should stretch the campaign until sickness, hunger, or politics eroded the enemy's will. Carthage itself had used this playbook in the First Punic War, wearing down Rome's finances and manpower over 23 years. The Fabian strategy, named for Quintus Fabius Maximus, was a variation of this: shadow the enemy, disrupt foraging parties, refuse battle. For a commander as outnumbered and outsupplied as Hannibal, every manual said the same thing: do not present your army in open ground against 8 legions. There was a third conventional solution: if forced to fight, align your best troops opposite the enemy's strongest. Match heavy infantry against heavy infantry, cavalry against cavalry, and hoped that superior leadership would create a local breakthrough. This is how Hellenistic generals did battle: lines crashing into lines, reserves thrown in, cavalry exploiting gaps. In such contests, numerical disparity often told. Hannibal had fewer heavy infantry than Rome, and his cavalry advantage would be hard-pressed to decide a battle before the Roman foot closed with his center. All these options were available to Hannibal, and all were doomed. Avoiding battle would cede the initiative to Rome. Every day spent foraging was a day closer to starvation. Roman armies could hover near his encampment and cut off his foragers, as Fabius had done, forcing him to retreat or risk being caught hungry. Time was on Rome's side. Their alliance system could field fresh legions year after year. Dragging out the war meant watching his own army waste away, desert or be starved into mutiny. To fight conventionally, to place his heavy African infantry directly opposite the Roman legions, was to commit suicide. The Romans had more men in armor, more ranks in depth, and a machine-like method of replacement. The first line fought until exhaustion, then fell back behind the fresh second and third lines. Hannibal's Africans had no reserves. When they tired, there would be no one to relieve them. A frontal contest would grind them down. Even the standard, elite cavalry flanking maneuver would not suffice. Hannibal's horsemen were superior, but they could not simply ride behind an enemy while the center broke under pressure. Cavalry needed space and time to envelop. If the infantry line crumbled too soon, the cavalry would return only to find their own camps lost. Nor could Hannibal rely solely on harassment. His supplies were already thin. He needed grain and fodder. Italy was not a desert, it was farmland dotted with walled towns. Each village he passed without capturing became a hostile fortress to his rear. Each day he remained in Apulia risked Roman relief forces closing in from other provinces. The Romans, for their part, had their own doctrinal prison. Their citizens expected decisive action. Their consuls were elected for 1 year and judged by victory or defeat. Fabius' scorched earth and avoidance strategy had been met with scorn. Varro's election was a repudiation of that caution. Rome could not conceive of abandoning a field when their enemy stood before them. To them, anything other than direct battle was cowardice. Their logistics and numbers made them confident that a straight fight would succeed. They had witnessed Hannibal's victories but explained them away as flukes of terrain: fog at Trasimene, a swollen river at Trebia. They believed an open plain would negate his tricks. Their correct approach was to bring him to battle, crush his weakened center and cut down his cavalry. Had they faced anyone else, it might have worked. The doctrine also told them to keep formation tight. Roman maniples in the triplex aces were spaced to support each other. They needed room to rotate, but not so much that gaps could be exploited. They advanced shoulder to shoulder, pushing ahead in a dense mass. In prior battles, this density allowed them to absorb casualties while maintaining momentum. At Cannae, the same density would become a trap. The doctrine did not address what happens when the enemy center does not break but bends. The manuals did not contemplate an opponent who would deliberately fall back and draw the aggressors forward into a pocket. There was no instruction for what to do when the field shrinks around you and you cannot swing a sword. Blind faith in the correct way of fighting left no room for adaptation. The deeper tension is this: every orthodox move available to each side pointed toward defeat. If Hannibal followed conventional wisdom and avoided battle, he would starve. If he fought head-on, he would be crushed. If he tried to fight asymmetrically while out in the open, his infantry would be isolated. If Rome followed its playbook and assaulted with depth, it would be drawn into a pocket. If it refused battle, it would cede the field and further embolden Hannibal. If it adopted Fabian tactics, its political leadership would unravel. Both armies were trapped by their own teachings and expectations. The manual answers were contradictions. One commander saw this and decided to weaponize his opponent's doctrine. What, then, did Hannibal decide to do? How do you create a plan when every page of the manual tells you not to be where you are? The answer was to invert the principles themselves. He would use his thin center as bait and his cavalry not merely to flank but to seal off retreat. He would turn the Romans' massed formation into a weakness by compressing it. He would make the plain that seemed an advantage for Rome into a vice. This required confidence that his mixed troops would hold long enough and that his enemy would behave predictably. It also required breaking away from his own people's cautious habits. His officers had to be convinced, his troops had to be willing to play a sacrificial role, and his camp followers needed to see the logic of fighting now rather than later. Only by stepping outside the doctrine could he hope to survive, but such a decision would come at a cost we have not yet considered. Within Hannibal's sprawling bivouac on the south bank of the Aufidus, the decision to gamble everything on a baited center was not taken lightly. He had been campaigning for 2 years across Italy. His officers had seen desperate fights and desperate improvisations. They had also seen comrades die and allies melt away. As he gathered his lieutenants, Brother Mago, cavalry commander Hasdrubal, Numidian Prince Maharbal, chiefs from Spain and Gaul, he knew the conventional options were closed. Some urged caution. Mago reminded him that the army had yet to capture a single walled city. Wasting troops on a pitched battle could doom them before reinforcements arrived. Maharbal, whose cavalry would bear the burden of the encirclement, questioned whether their horses could maneuver behind such a deep Roman line before the center collapsed. Others fretted over morale. The Gauls were brave but mercurial. Would they hold when the Romans crashed into them? The Africans were disciplined but vastly outnumbered. Could they pivot from the flanks without breaking formation? Hannibal's own voice was the anchor. He had led them over the Pyrenees, through the Rhone, across the Alps. They trusted him because he had always been present when the fighting was worst, and because his risks had paid off. He laid out a plan that broke from every tradition. He would bend, not break. The center, composed of Gauls and Iberians, would advance slightly to provoke the Romans, then yield in controlled retreat. They would form a concave pocket. On the flanks, his hardened Africans would remain in place, waiting to pivot inward when the Romans were sucked into the trap. The cavalry would not merely guard the wings but would smash the Roman horse, then ride behind the enemy's infantry and close the circle. Hannibal himself would stand with the Gauls and Spaniards at the center, both to command and to steady them with his presence. He entrusted Hasdrubal with the heavier cavalry on the left and Maharbal with the Numidians on the right, relying on their speed and discipline to execute the encirclement. This plan rested on a set of audacious assumptions. First, it assumed that the Romans, seeing a slightly bowed center and eager to avenge past defeats, would commit fully to a frontal assault. Hannibal wagered on their temperament and their doctrine. He believed they would value momentum over caution and push deep into the concave formation. Second, it assumed that his own center, Gauls who had little stake beyond loot and Iberians far from home, would not panic. He counted on their pride, their desire for plunder and his personal presence to hold them just long enough. Third, he assumed that his cavalry would achieve local superiority quickly. The Numidians needed to keep the Roman allied cavalry occupied. The Spaniards and Gauls on Hasdrubal's flank needed to rout the Roman citizen cavalry and then return in time to strike the Roman infantry from behind. The entire operation depended on timing. A delay in any part would unravel the rest. Finally, he assumed that the environment would work for him. The wind would blow dust into Roman faces, the sun would blind them, and their deep formation would become a liability as men at the back pressed those in front. Critics within the camp raised every possible objection. What if the Romans refused battle? They had after all shadowed him for months. Hannibal answered by sending small detachments to plunder near the Roman supply depot at Cannae, forcing the consuls to respond. What if the Romans adopted a thinner line and refused to penetrate? Hannibal noted that Varro's reputation hinged on delivering a decisive blow. Caution was not in his nature. What if the Gauls fled? Then the plan would collapse, and with it their chance of ever leaving Italy. He offered them the center not as a death sentence but as a stage. They would be at the heart of the most famous victory in history. To further bind them, he allowed them to wear trophies taken from earlier battles, making them appear more formidable and giving them a personal stake in the fight. For the Africans, he emphasized discipline. Their pivot would decide everything. For the cavalry, he promised the freedom to pursue and plunder only after the encirclement was complete. The core of this strategy targeted Rome's psychology. Hannibal had observed that Roman consuls often fought to win fame in a single year of office. They wanted a spectacular victory. He would offer one that was too tempting to refuse. He manipulated information by displaying his center openly, letting Roman scouts see Gauls and Spaniards in looser formation. He hid nothing. Instead, he showed them exactly what he wanted them to see. He exploited time by choosing the day when Varro held command, knowing his aggressive reputation. He used the command structure against them. The dual consular command meant that hesitation or caution could be overridden by zeal. On the logistical front, he chose a battlefield far from easy water access for the Romans and near his own camp's wells. He forced them to face into the sun and dust. He knew that soldiers deprived of water, fighting uphill into wind and grit, would tire quickly. He also targeted their formation itself. By bending his line he would make their depth a disadvantage. In essence, the blow was aimed not at their bodies first but at their doctrine, their perceptions, and their rhythms. Within his own command structure, Hannibal had to enforce unity. Carthaginian generals were often more like contractors than officers. They commanded allied contingents that owed loyalty to their own leaders. To execute a maneuver that required split-second coordination, he needed them to act as one. He convened his captains repeatedly, walking them through the timing. He delegated clear, simple tasks: Hasdrubal smash and return, Maharbal delay then strike, Africans hold then pivot, center entice then bend. He communicated the plan down the ranks not through written orders but through repeated briefings and personal appeals. He personally inspected the weapons, ensuring that the African infantry's captured Roman gear would confuse the enemy in the melee. He placed trusted staff officers at critical junctures to relay signals. Opposition lingered, but Hannibal's conviction and the logic of their predicament swayed most. Maharbal is said to have voiced doubts, yet on the day he executed his role with precision. After the battle, he would tell Hannibal that he knew how to win but not how to use victory, hinting at tensions that survived even triumph. During the planning, however, those tensions were channeled into action. The decision to bend the center and envelop the enemy was no impulsive stroke. It was a calculated response to a scenario with no safe options. It required courage to conceive and discipline to execute. It also required accepting that many of his men in the center were being placed in harm's way deliberately. As the sun rose on that August morning, the die was cast. Hannibal had chosen to fight in a way no manual would endorse, trusting that his reading of Roman behavior and his management of disparate troops would hold true. The Romans, equally, were preparing to fight as they had always been taught, confident that their virtue and numbers would prevail. Both armies were about to enter a pattern neither had ever seen before. The decision had been made, now it would be tested in the chaos of battle, where one misstep could undo everything. A plan drawn in the dust of a commander's tent is one thing, turning that plan into action amid shouting men and flying javelins is quite another. As dawn broke over the plain of Cannae, Hannibal's army formed a shallow crescent. The Gauls and Iberians in the center stepped forward slightly, their line bulging outward toward the Roman legions. The Africans on the flanks anchored themselves a few paces behind, shields locked, spears at the ready. Hannibal rode along the front, speaking to each cohort. He reminded the Gauls that they would stand at the heart of history, that their job was not to win but to hold and bend. He told the Iberians that their curved falcata swords could cut through Roman bronze if they aimed at the joints. He told the Africans that the moment to pivot would be obvious, they were to wait until they saw the Romans deep in the pocket, then turn inward like doors closing. Behind the infantry, Hasdrubal massed his Spanish and Gallic cavalry on the Carthaginian left. Maharbal gathered his Numidians on the right, swirling their horses in tight circles as if already in motion. Across the field, the Romans drew up in an unusually deep column, perhaps 30 ranks. Varro wanted to smash through the center quickly, separate the Carthaginian wings and roll them up. Paulus, commanding the right wing that day, would have urged caution, but his turn to lead would not come for another day. Trumpets blared. The Roman heavy infantry surged forward. Each man carried a large scutum shield and a gladius, confident that sheer momentum would shatter the smaller men in front. The dust rose in sheets. The sun was already hot. Hannibal's line held for a heartbeat, then began to give ground. This was intentional. The Gauls and Iberians took one step back, then another, swinging their swords and spears but never stopping. Roman pila, javelins, flew overhead, some clattering harmlessly against raised shields, others sinking into flesh. The Carthaginian center bent inward. To the Romans, it looked like weakness. To Hannibal, it was the pocket forming. Meanwhile, on the left flank, Hasdrubal's cavalry crashed into the Roman citizen horse. Roman cavalrymen were not as numerous nor as cohesive, they fought in smaller contingents led by individual noblemen. Hasdrubal's Spaniards and Gauls fought with a mix of spears and short swords, dismounting when necessary to grapple and kill. Within minutes, the Roman right-wing cavalry began to give way. Some accounts suggest that Paulus, who commanded the Roman right, was wounded early in this melee. Whether or not he fell at this moment, his presence ceased to influence the fight. This micro-twist, a commander struck down amid chaotic horse combat, removed one of the two voices that might have restrained Roman impetuosity. On the Carthaginian right, Maharbal's Numidians did not charge headlong. They skirmished, throwing javelins and feinting, drawing the Roman allied cavalry out of line. They harassed but did not commit, buying time. Their mission was not victory but delay. They could not afford to be lured into a prolonged fight that would keep them from circling behind later. As the Carthaginian center continued to fall back, the Romans poured into the gap. The deep column compressed. Men in the rear pushed those in front found themselves hemmed in by the Gauls and Iberians on three sides. Some Roman soldiers tried to swing their swords only to find their arms pinned by their comrades' shoulders. Others, tripping over corpses, looked up and realized that the Africans on both flanks were not retreating but pivoting. At this critical moment, Hasdrubal executed his second task. Leaving a detachment to chase the remnants of the Roman citizen cavalry, he wheeled a portion of his horsemen behind the Roman infantry. They galloped across the open plain, their horses' hooves kicking up dust. They met little resistance. The Roman allied cavalry, still entangled with Hannibal's Numidians, could not intercept them. This was another risky moment. Had the Romans held their cavalry in reserve or sent a cohort to guard their rear, Hasdrubal might have been cut down. Instead, he rode unopposed, swinging around the mass of Roman infantry and slamming into their rear ranks. The Africans saw the signal, the collapse of the Roman cavalry, the deep penetration of the Roman infantry, and turned inward. They formed two solid walls pressing against the Roman flanks. Their equipment, much of it taken from previous Roman defeats, made them look like Roman soldiers themselves. This caused confusion. Some Romans hesitated, thinking they faced friendly troops and allowing the Africans to close the gap. Others, realizing the trap, tried to peel away, but there was nowhere to go. The river lay to the north, a bank behind them, and Carthaginian horsemen were already visible to the rear. The pocket became a circle. Hannibal's center stopped retreating and held its ground. Now the Romans were under attack from every side. Bodies piled up. Men slipped on blood and gore. The noise became a roar of metal on metal and the screams of the wounded. One micro-twist occurred here. The heat and dust began to affect both sides. Hannibal's troops in the center had been fighting and retreating under direct sun for hours. Some Gauls began to sag, their movements slowing. Hannibal rode through them, forcing them back into position. At one point, he is said to have dismounted and fought alongside them, reinvigorating their morale. This could have been the moment the center broke. Had the Gauls fled now, the Africans would have been isolated and the cavalry encirclement could have become a trap for Carthage instead of Rome. But personal example and the knowledge that there was no escape stiffened them. Another twist, a contingent of Romans near the right flank, perhaps led by Paulus's surviving officers, attempted to break through the African wall. They succeeded in creating a small gap and a few hundred men escaped the circle. This local success highlighted how thin the line between total destruction and partial survival was. If more Romans had broken through, the army might have reformed outside the encirclement. But the breach was sealed quickly. Carthaginian light troops and cavalry cut down the fugitives. Logistics played their part in this chaos. Hannibal's control of water meant his men could drink before and during the battle. Roman soldiers, confined in the pocket, could not reach the river. Heat exhaustion set in. Dust clogged their throats. Thirst sapped their strength. The longer the fight continued, the weaker they became. Hannibal had chosen the start time to maximize the effect of the sun. The Romans were forced to fight with it in their eyes. He had also positioned his camp to funnel prisoners away quickly. Carthaginian troops could drag Roman captives behind the lines without disrupting the fight, while any Roman soldier taken prisoner disappeared from sight, further sapping morale. The encirclement tightened. Hours passed. This was slaughter, not battle. Some Romans threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Carthaginian soldiers, fueled by years of privation and the promise of revenge, showed little. Others tried to climb over the bodies to find air, only to be cut down. Roman senators and tribunes died alongside their men. A young officer named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would later defeat Hannibal at Zama, was among those who hacked their way out. His escape was another micro-twist, a thread of fate that would alter history. By late afternoon, resistance collapsed. Hannibal's men moved systematically, killing or capturing the remaining Romans. When it was over, perhaps 50,000 Romans lay dead. Carthaginian losses numbered in the thousands, mainly among the Gauls and Iberians who had formed the bait. What points could have toppled this plan? The first was timing. If Hasdrubal's cavalry had not returned in time, the Romans might have found an opening to retreat. The second was morale. If the Gauls had panicked or the Africans had pivoted too soon, the circle would not have closed. The third was identification. Wearing captured Roman armor risked friendly fire. In the dust and chaos, Africans striking at flanks could have hit their own allies. The fourth was leadership. Had Paulus remained uninjured and taken command of the Roman center, he might have signaled a withdrawal before the pocket closed. The fifth was environment. A change in wind could have blown dust the other way, clearing Roman vision. A cloud could have obscured the sun. These were not under Hannibal's control. Every minute of the battle was a dance with contingency. Through all of this, Hannibal directed his forces with signals and runners. His camp followers were ready to supply water and carry away the wounded. He did not celebrate when the circle closed, he pressed his men to complete the work. He knew that a trapped army is most dangerous when it realizes it is doomed. The Romans fought with the desperation of the cornered. Only when the last organized resistance faded did Hannibal allow his troops to rest. They had executed a maneuver that would be studied for millennia. But even as he surveyed the field, the general was aware that victory on paper and victory in reality were different things. The trap had sprung and the slaughter was complete, yet the battle's psychology was only beginning to unfold in the minds of those who survived and those who led. The Romans did not stumble blindly into Hannibal's trap, they walked into it with their eyes fixed on the wrong signals. From the moment their scouts reported the Carthaginian deployment, Varro believed he saw weakness. The enemy center jutted forward. The wings seemed thin. There was no sign of hidden troops in the hills or woods, because there were no hills or woods. Every visible indicator confirmed their doctrine: crush the center, split the army, and let your superior infantry dictate the result. Even the way Hannibal had his men withdraw from the river the day before, ceding access to water, looked like desperation. They concluded he was on his last legs, thirsty and cornered. This misreading began before the first horn sounded. As the battle opened and Hannibal's center began its controlled retreat, the Roman infantrymen felt the confirmation of their expectations. Each step backward taken by a Gaul or Spaniard felt like Roman momentum. Soldiers shouted that the barbarians were running. The sheer weight of their formation pressed them forward. Dust swirled around their sandals and they could barely see the sky, but they could see the line in front of them bending. Their officers gave no orders to slow down. According to doctrine, now was the time to push harder. They were told that the enemy would break if they pressed. That had always been true. The deeper they pushed, the more they believed that the moment of victory was at hand. Their standard bearers advanced, the legionary eagles seemed to cut through the dust like swords. Yet the signals were deceptive by design. Hannibal did not hide his troops, he hid his intentions. The Romans saw Gauls and Spaniards giving ground and concluded they were losing. They saw Africans standing still and concluded they had been held in reserve for a doomed defense. They saw the Numidian cavalry skirmishing and thought they were playing for time because they were weak. They saw Hasdrubal ride off with his cavalry and assumed he would pursue the routed Roman horse and not return. Their perceptions were filtered through their own expectations. Their prejudice against barbarian warriors made them underestimate the discipline required to conduct a fighting withdrawal. Their experience told them that no commander would deliberately weaken his center. Their belief in the superiority of heavy infantry convinced them that nothing could stop a deep push, and their political culture punished hesitation. Even when some soldiers noticed the Africans pivoting, they did not understand what was happening until it was too late. The Romans also misread the terrain. They believed the open plain removed the risk of ambush, but they did not consider how the river would trap them if forced back. They did not see how the wind and sun were being used against them. They did not anticipate that their own formation could become a prison. In previous battles, depth had protected them; here, it compressed them. The doctrine did not address the possibility that you might need to expand rather than press forward. It provided no instruction for how to respond when the enemy falls back while drawing you into a pocket. This conceptual blind spot left officers without guidance when the Carthaginian wings pivoted. Paulus, wounded early in the cavalry melee, could not issue new orders. Varro was on the opposite flank, unable to see the entire field. Centurions at the front could not communicate with the rear. By the time some realized the danger, they could not maneuver. Their command structure exacerbated the problem. The rotating consular command created a situation in which strategic disagreement had been bottled up and then burst on the battlefield. Paulus was the cautious one, Varro the aggressive one. On Varro's day, there was no one to override his plan. When Paulus tried to pull some troops back on the right, the center continued to push forward. There was no single voice to coordinate. Once he was injured, the army effectively fought on autopilot, following the plan set in motion earlier. The rigidity of Roman military culture, where orders were to be obeyed without question, left little room for individual initiative in a crisis. When the encirclement began, only a few pockets attempted to break through. Others, even sensing the danger, simply held their ground because they had not been ordered otherwise. The consular system, designed to prevent autocracy, became a fatal liability in the face of an enemy who could decide alone. Misinformation and confusion amplified these structural weaknesses. Hannibal's Africans wore captured Roman armor. In the dust, many Romans mistook them for allies and did not strike until it was too late. Signals from trumpets were muffled by the roar of battle. Light troops carrying messages were cut down by cavalry. Some Romans believed they had achieved a breakthrough on the right when they saw their cavalry returning. They did not realize those were Carthaginians coming to close the trap. Others mistook the shift in the Numidian skirmishing line for a retreat and tried to pursue, only to be isolated and cut down. Rumors spread quickly: the enemy center is collapsing. The consul is dead. The enemy cavalry is fleeing. Each falsehood drove men deeper into the pocket or froze them in place. Why did they not adapt when the danger became clear? Partly because the Roman army lacked practice in fighting encircled. Their drills assumed they would be on the offensive. They had no doctrine for forming a hollow square while surrounded, or for breaking out in multiple directions. They were trained to rotate lines forward, not sideways. Their mindset was offensive and linear. When they found themselves attacked from the sides and rear, they tried to turn individually, creating chaos. By contrast, Hannibal's Africans had been trained specifically to pivot. His cavalry was instructed in regrouping after a charge. He had given his men simple cues. The Romans relied on a chain of command that was severed by confusion. There was also overconfidence. The Romans believed that sheer numbers would carry the day. Many of them had never been beaten in battle. Those who had survived Trebia or Trasimene explained their defeats as anomalous. They did not respect Hannibal's ability to innovate because their cultural narrative told them that discipline and courage mattered more than cunning. This overconfidence made them less receptive to warning signs. Even when some centurions called for caution, their voices were drowned by the general clamor. This is not to say that Romans were foolish; they were trapped by their own success. Institutions that build strength can also build inflexibility. The breaking point came when the Romans realized the African infantry were not retreating but closing. That moment, when the concave center halted and the flanks pivoted inward, was the psychological collapse. Soldiers in the front ranks suddenly saw spears thrusting at them from their own sides. Those in the rear felt pressure from behind as Hasdrubal's cavalry slammed into them. The space in which they could fight shrank rapidly. Panic spread faster than orders. They were no longer the attackers, they were prey. Up to that point, each man had believed he was part of a relentless tide. Now he felt alone in a crush of bodies. The shift from confidence to terror happened in a heartbeat. Hannibal had engineered this DMB by using their own momentum. He had used what they wanted, an overwhelming charge, to place them exactly where he needed them. Could they have interpreted the signals differently? Possibly. Had they noticed that Hannibal himself stood with the Gauls in the center, they might have suspected a trap. A commander does not place himself in the weakest point of his line. Had they questioned why the African infantry wore Roman gear, they might have been more cautious. Had they observed the Numidian skirmishing as a ruse rather than a genuine fight, they might have held back their allied cavalry. But these counterfactuals require a mindset that the Romans did not possess in 216 BCE. Their culture valued straightforwardness, their training reinforced aggression, their command structure did not reward improvisation. The misinterpretation was not just tactical, it was strategic. Romans believed that a single defeat could not break them, that they could absorb losses and rebuild. In a sense they were correct. Rome would recover from Cannae. But that belief also made them underestimate the immediate danger. They fought to defend honor and maintain their alliances, but in doing so they placed themselves where they could not help either. Hannibal, conversely, overestimated the strategic impact of a single victory. He believed Rome would sue for peace. Both sides misread the other's resilience. The Romans misread the battle, Hannibal misread the war. This symmetry of misunderstanding is one of Cannae's paradoxes. As the encirclement drew tight, some Romans attempted to negotiate or surrender. Hannibal reportedly gave orders to accept surrenders, both to reduce Carthaginian casualties and to increase the number of prisoners he could barter later. This may have led some Romans to lay down arms who could otherwise have fought. Others fought to the end. When the killing finally stopped, the survivors were marched into captivity. The consuls had misread signals, their army had been annihilated. Yet the story of misinterpretation did not end on the battlefield. News of the defeat would ripple through the Republic, causing fear, recrimination, and debate about strategy. Hannibal's victory would embolden allies to defect and enemies to strike. It would also harden Rome's resolve. The cost of this misunderstanding was about to be measured not just in corpses on a plain but in the political and human toll that followed. When the last Roman cry faded and the last blade fell silent, the field at Cannae looked like an abattoir. Bodies lay so thick that Carthaginian soldiers had to climb over piles of corpses to survey their handiwork. In some areas the dead were stacked in layers, men had suffocated under the weight of comrades before any sword touched them. The numbers staggered even hardened veterans. Polybius reports that 70,000 Romans died, Livy suggests nearly 50,000. Either figure represented a fifth of all Roman males of military age. Some 14,000 more were taken prisoner. Few on the Roman side escaped unscathed, those who did were banished from Rome's political life, a reminder that survival could itself be a stigma. On the Carthaginian side, estimates range from 5,000 to 8,000 dead, most of them Gauls and Iberians in the center, the very men who had been asked to play bait. The Africans and cavalry suffered relatively few casualties. The human cost was unevenly distributed, and it was paid disproportionately by those whose loyalty had been purchased with promises and plunder. This imbalance underscores the moral cost of Hannibal's strategy. He had deliberately placed his less reliable troops where they would absorb the brunt of the Roman attack. He stood with them, but he knew many would die. It was, in his view, the only way to save the rest. The Africans who pivoted, the Numidians who encircled, owed their survival to the sacrifice of the center. The psychological burden of ordering such a sacrifice cannot be ignored. After the battle, Hannibal is said to have mourned his losses privately even as he exulted publicly. The survivors in the center might have felt honor at being essential to the victory, but they also felt betrayed, they had been used as a shield. This tension would linger in Hannibal's army, contributing to later desertions. The logistical cost was also profound. Hannibal's army looted the Roman camp and the battlefield, gathering swords, armor, and standards. The plunder replenished some supplies and paid the troops. Yet the battle consumed irreplaceable resources. Horses were killed or exhausted, weapons were dulled or broken, medical supplies were depleted. Hannibal could not easily replace his Spanish and Gallic infantry. Rome could, and did, levy new legions within months. The African infantry and Numidian cavalry would have to do more with less as the campaign continued. The victory did not conjure a supply base. Hannibal still had no port, no secure lines of communication to Carthage or Spain. He remained dependent on plunder and the goodwill of allied towns. In killing tens of thousands of Romans, he inadvertently triggered Rome's decision to field even larger armies and to commit to a war of attrition. The political cost to Rome was immediate and terrifying. Senators panicked. Some advocated abandoning Italy. Others suggested negotiating with Hannibal. The dictator Fabius, previously derided as cowardly, now seemed prescient. Rome declared a national day of mourning. They refused to ransom the captives, a harsh decision meant to prove that Rome would never pay for the return of citizens who surrendered. They sold public property to fund new legions and lowered the property qualifications for military service, enlisting adolescents and old men. They executed or banished officers deemed responsible. The psychological shock was profound. Mothers shaved their heads, fathers wore mourning clothes. Yet this cost also galvanized resolve. Rome swore to fight until victory. They refused to send peace envoys. In a grim calculus, the losses at Cannae made Rome more willing to endure further losses. The political cost to Carthage, paradoxically, was less visible at first but ultimately fatal. Hannibal's victory did not produce the wave of defections he had expected. Some southern Italian cities and tribes changed sides, but many remained loyal to Rome. Carthage's Senate, dominated by mercantile families, viewed Hannibal's triumph with suspicion. They sent only one small reinforcement in the years that followed. They were unwilling to commit their own sons to a war they had never wanted. This decision sealed Hannibal's fate. Without substantial reinforcements, he could not besiege Rome or hold the cities he had liberated. He spent the next decade wandering Italy, fighting smaller battles, never again able to deliver a blow like Cannae. Meanwhile, Rome recovered, retook lost allies and invaded Spain and North Africa. The strategic cost of Carthage's inaction outweighed the tactical benefit of Hannibal's success. There were also costs to Hannibal himself. He had built his plan on the assumption that Rome would negotiate after a catastrophic defeat. They did not. Instead, they adopted a strategy of avoidance, harassment, and exhaustion. Hannibal found himself in a stalemate. His army dwindled through attrition. He had to watch as opportunities slipped away. His brother Hasdrubal was defeated trying to bring reinforcements. His appeals to Carthage were ignored. Italian allies who had joined him faced brutal reprisals. The psychological weight of knowing that his greatest victory had failed to end the war must have been immense. When he was finally recalled to Africa in 203 BCE, he told the Carthaginian Senate that they had sabotaged his efforts. He fought one more battle, Zama, and lost. The hero of Cannae became an exile. In the end, he committed suicide rather than be handed over to Rome. His personal cost was the hollowing out of his own legend. For Rome, the long-term cost included a hardening of its military ethos. They executed the decimation of legions that had shown cowardice, they sent Cannae's survivors to distant garrisons, and they restructured their armies to be more flexible. They also extended citizenship to some allies, strengthening the very system Hannibal had hoped to break. The memory of Cannae haunted Roman generals for generations. At Zama, Scipio Africanus used a modified version of Hannibal's tactics to defeat him, spacing his maniples wider and allowing elephants to pass through. In future civil wars, Roman commanders invoked Cannae as both a model to emulate and a disaster to avoid. The battle became a legend, a cautionary tale about overconfidence and a case study in envelopments taught in war colleges thousands of years later. This intellectual legacy is a cost in its own way. It trapped future commanders into thinking that every numerical inferiority could be offset by a Cannae, sometimes with disastrous results. What if Hannibal had failed at Cannae? The cost would have been different but no less significant. His army would have been destroyed. Carthage might have sued for peace quickly, ceding its Spanish territories. Rome would have been emboldened, perhaps less cautious about future conflicts. But because Hannibal succeeded tactically and failed strategically, the war dragged on, draining both societies. Thousands more would die in Italy, Spain, and North Africa. The war's economic cost was staggering. Farms were burned, populations displaced, wealth consumed. The battle's psychological cost endured. Italian villagers recounted tales of Cannae for generations. Roman mothers used Hannibal as a bogeyman to frighten children into obedience. There is an ethical cost, too, often overlooked. Hannibal's victory is celebrated as brilliance, but it involved deliberate sacrifice of thousands of his own men and systematic slaughter of an enemy that was, for moments, helpless. Rome's refusal to ransom its captives condemned thousands to slavery or execution. Both sides made choices that reveal the brutal logic of ancient warfare. Lives were currency, expended for strategic advantage. Understanding Cannae requires confronting this harsh reality. To admire the tactic without acknowledging the human cost is to miss the point. As dusk settled over the carnage, scavengers descended, and the stench of death rose. Survivors stumbled away, carrying scars physical and mental. Messengers galloped toward Rome and Carthage with news that would shape policy for years. Hannibal stood amid the wreckage of the Roman army and knew he had achieved something unprecedented. Yet he also sensed that the war was not over, that the cost paid here might be only the beginning of a wider price. What strategic lessons can we draw from a victory that shattered armies but failed to end a war? In the final part, we will decode the principles behind the Cannae model and ask whether its genius can ever be reproduced without paying its terrible price. Cannae is often presented as a masterpiece of battlefield geometry, a textbook illustration of how to envelop a larger force. But the heart of Hannibal's strategy is not a diagram, it is a way of thinking. The double envelopment was a tool. The purpose was to turn the opponent's own strengths and assumptions into weaknesses. Hannibal did not hide his army, he hid his intent. He took the Roman desire for decisive battle and offered it in a form that destroyed them. At its core, his strategy was about manipulating perception, timing, and space. He recognized that his material disadvantages, fewer heavy infantry, no supply base, political isolation, left him with only one asset: superior understanding of his enemy's mind and of the environment. He used that asset ruthlessly. What rules did he break? First, he violated the principle that the center must be strong. He created a center designed to bend. He trusted that his opponents would interpret bending as breaking. Second, he defied the maxim that one should avoid open battle when outnumbered. He sought it deliberately, because avoiding it would lead to starvation and dispersal. Third, he inverted the typical use of cavalry. Rather than merely protecting his flanks or chasing fleeing enemies, he used his cavalry as a hammer to close the pocket. He subordinated their instinct for pursuit to a broader design. Fourth, he challenged the idea that reserves should be held back until needed. His plan required every element to be committed early. There would be no second chance. And fifth, he broke the conventional wisdom that victory in battle could secure victory in war. He believed it could. History proved otherwise. Can such a strategy be repeated? The temptation to emulate Cannae has ensnared generals for centuries. Alfred von Schlieffen based his plan for invading France in 1914 on a massive right-wing envelopment reminiscent of Hannibal's. The result was a stalemate and slaughter. German commanders sought another Cannae at Tannenberg in 1914 and succeeded tactically, but it did not end the war. Soviet planners encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, creating a modern Cannae. The Germans attempted their own at Kursk and failed. Napoleon at Austerlitz used elements of the Cannae model, inviting the Allies to attack his weakened flank and then smashing them. But Napoleon did not always succeed. At Waterloo, the tactic failed. Modern battlefields rarely present the convergence of factors that made Hannibal's plan possible. The ability to control what the enemy sees is diminished by reconnaissance and communications. The willingness to sacrifice thousands of your own center is constrained by political and ethical considerations. The lesson is not that double envelopments never work, but that they cannot be willed into existence by mere desire. They require an opponent with predictable doctrines, a terrain that allows maneuver, a force with versatile cavalry, and a commander willing to accept severe risks. What principles can we extract? The first is that understanding your adversary's cognitive patterns can be more powerful than numerical strength. Hannibal won because he knew how the Roman consuls would think and react. He weaponized their impatience and confidence. Modern commanders should study not only their enemy's capabilities but also their decision-making biases. The second principle is that constraints can become instruments. Hannibal's lack of a base compelled him to fight, but he turned the river, wind, and sun into allies. He used dust as a screen, heat as a weapon, and a riverbank as a wall. In contemporary terms, logistical or environmental disadvantages can be reframed as opportunities if integrated into the plan. The third principle is that tactical brilliance must serve strategic logic. Hannibal expected Cannae to end the war. He was wrong because he misjudged Rome's political resilience and Carthage's unwillingness to support him. His victory, unmatched on the field, left him strategically stranded. A brilliant maneuver that does not align with supply, diplomacy, and long-term objectives may be spectacular but futile. The fourth principle is ethical awareness. Sacrificing part of your force may win a battle, but it incurs moral debt. Commanders must weigh whether the gain justifies the loss of trust and lives. Hannibal's center was expendable in his calculus. The cost of that choice reverberated through his army. Cannae also teaches humility. Great leaders can miscalculate. Hannibal's interpretation of Roman politics was wrong. He underestimated the Republic's capacity to regenerate armies and to learn. Rome adapted. It adopted Fabian tactics, avoided pitched battles, slowly strangled his campaign. Hannibal, meanwhile, did not adjust his strategic vision. His plan for Cannae was perfect for that day, but his vision for the war lacked the same flexibility. From this we draw another principle: success can entrench error if it reinforces false assumptions. After a stunning victory, leaders must re-evaluate. The conditions that enabled the success may not persist. Clinging to the hope that one more Cannae will bring the enemy to their knees can be a strategic trap. In a broader sense, the story of Cannae is about the interplay between genius and structure. Individual brilliance can achieve wonders within a battle, but it cannot indefinitely override systemic disadvantages. Hannibal's army was a patchwork of peoples with tenuous loyalty. His political backing at home was weak. His supply situation was precarious. Rome's system, by contrast, was brutal but robust. Even after losing a fifth of its fighting men, the Republic could field more. The Cannae model is seductive because it promises that thought can overcome matter, that a smaller force can annihilate a larger one through cleverness. Sometimes it can. But only if the cleverness extends beyond the tactical to the institutional. Only if the state or organization employing the tactic understands the long game. For modern audiences, what does this mean? It means that when studying Cannae, we should admire the ingenuity but resist the urge to replicate it wholesale. We should ask, what does our opponent believe? How can we show them what they expect to see while planning something else? How can we use the environment, physical, informational, temporal, to shape their decisions? How do we ensure that a tactical success fits into a strategic framework? And how do we prepare for the moment when the enemy does not behave as expected? The double envelopment is one answer to one set of problems. Its larger lesson is about adaptation, perception, and the unity of action and purpose. Cannae resonates today because it speaks to fundamental human themes: overconfidence, risk, innovation, and the cost of brilliance. It reminds us that no doctrine is infallible, that underdogs can prevail through insight, and that victory on one level can mask failure on another. It warns us against the hubris of thinking we have found a universal solution. It invites us to think like strategists, not just tacticians. Cannae closed with the sun setting over a field of death, yet its echoes continue to shape military thought. Hannibal's daring maneuver has become a legend and a lesson, a testament to what is possible and a warning about what is not. It is a case study in the marriage of audacity and calculation, of courage and ruthlessness. Future episodes in this series will explore other moments when commanders tore up the rulebook, moments when they bet everything on a fragile assumption and forced history to take a different path. For now, Cannae stands as both monument and cautionary tale, a reminder that the art of war is as much about the mind as the sword.